This is a Squiz podcast. We're your shortcut to being informed. Quite a bit about the COVID-19 pandemic, and that's because late last year the Albanese government announced an independent report would be commissioned into our federal response. The idea being to look at what we did well, what we didn't do well, and what we could do better next time. It was released this week. The reason I said specifically to look at the federal response is that this was deliberately not to look at the state responses.
And that was quite a talking point at the time. There was a lot of criticism about that because, of course, as we learned during the pandemic, the states actually have a lot of control over our lives when it comes to
That was my number
health
one
responses.
takeout
Yeah.
from the whole pandemic.
Exactly. And that when it came to the response, they actually had a lot to say about it, or at least a lot of questions that could be asked about it.
Regardless of that sort of direction, the report did talk to the states quite a bit, and they were called out a lot. The key themes, though, more broadly about government were this massive loss of trust in government by the public. Some of the major factors for that include a lack of transparency and evidence for the decision-making and the decisions that were imposed on us, poor communication, the strictness and the duration of restrictions, access to vaccines, and inconsistencies to this point in the state and territory responses.
Yeah, it's all a bit triggering. And I went back actually working with the team this week to look at the COVID reporting that we did over that period of time. And down in the weeds of, the Northern Territory has announced X restriction after 9 people
I know,
had COVID.
Wild.
And just how on any given day, 3 or 4 different states would say 3 or 4 different things and have a very different response to it. It was highly confusing.
It's a weird time. That would be really strange to go back and read the Squiz from that time. Very odd. Other big problems identified was the need to close schools and the long-term effects that's had on those children affected by those closures. The report actually recommended avoiding school closures at all costs in future pandemics. And on the point around the states, did indicate that the Morrison government tried to have a national approach to schools. The effort was made, but schools are one of those things states control, and the rules were very different in every state.
Yes, so many decisions were state decisions. One part that was very much in the federal government's category, though, was the economic response. So the report that was out this week also talked about those interest rate cuts, how the federal bank responded with other sort of support in the economy, and, of course, did we spend too much? Well, of course, that JobKeeper response and how that has had an ongoing impact into inflation numbers even today.
Well, it directly said that we cut interest rates too quickly and too much, and that we spent too much. And that's all now contributing to high inflation. It's a really long report, Claire, really, really long.
860
pages.
A
lot of pages, but they did release like a cheat sheet to it and the recommendations that were made off the back of it. The headline for me was, we probably will have another pandemic. Like, that's happening.
Of course we will.
So let's prepare for it. There were 9 dot points, and the one that's been actioned immediately is establishing a permanent CDC. That's a Centre for Disease Control.
Yeah, so that's happening. And back to the point of trust, the other thing that was made very clear in the report is it will happen again. And because we just don't trust our governments, there's a real question about how do you get people vaccinated. There's been actually a big dip in vaccination numbers in the last couple of years across all sorts of vaccinations that we should be having. And also, how are we going to follow restrictions if they need to put them in place?
Yeah.
Because their sense is, given those hard lockdowns in some parts of Australia, we're very sceptical about it.
Yeah, and as I said, there's so much more in that report, but it all is a little bit triggering. However, it feels like enough time might have passed that we can have this conversation now. So that was a big news story this week.